once we fix our boundaries and we know what, we say no when we need to say no, and we're not affected by hearing no, a lot of the other stuff fixes itself.
It really had to do with my identity, honestly. Like if I flush, then that's less than. If I don't, then that's positive. If it got put there, it can be rewired. If it wasn't always there, because what will happen a lot of times in this community is we will think we found a solution and then it'll come back and then you're defeated again. So I was like, I can't focus on that anymore. I've got to just focus on like, what am I doing? Where am I going? What are my yeses? What are my nos? And just walk that path.
We have 100% control over. We have 0% control over everything out here. Now think about this. Now we've got all our psychological fuel in here, basically. Positive emotional energy. Now think about being in a traffic jam. We're mad, we grab the steering wheel and clench our fist and this type thing. And what we're doing when we do that is we have a hole here and our fuel here is draining out the bottom of it really fast.
Stand up straight, gonna rise like a champion.
Welcome back to Blushing Phoenix or April Pointer podcast if you're listening from there. So we're doing something a little different today. I have my friend Hank Thurmond here today. He is he runs the Viking Mindset podcast, and so he's being on Blushing Phoenix visually today. I am on his podcast, but we're going to dual that, and I'm going to use this audio for my podcast as well, because I think it's just going to be just such a great conversation for you all to hear and hopefully find some value and some positive impact from it. So Hank, will you tell us a little bit about you, about your podcast, anything that can help give a good introduction to you?
Well, my podcast is something that's been a goal of mine for years. I've been into self-development for, I guess probably 20 years now. I'm very much oriented that way, and I just wanted to find a way. I've got a really, my passion is clinical psychology, but I wanted to find a way to kind of get that out there because I'm not a licensed psychotherapist, not yet anyway. That's kind of where I'm headed with it, but that's about it. Really, I don't know. I reached out to April because she and I both worked together for the same company during the pandemic. And I found out I had a very pretty detailed background with learning boundaries and this type thing. And I knew April had talked about it, a lot in Zoom meetings and stuff. And I knew she was very knowledgeable. So I had reached out to her to see if she wanted to collaborate. So here we are.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm excited about today. Like I said, today will be a little bit of a different format and a bit of a different format for Hank as well, because this is a little off kilter for what you've done in the past. So with that said, let's just jump into what you would normally do with your podcast, or however you want to start off with that. And we will start the conversation and get going.
Well, April, you and I have had, when we talked last week, we talked about this. And in my opinion, the personal boundary is a very unique, and in my opinion, it's the most important aspect of our psychology, because it's the tank that holds everything else inside it. And what I mean by that is our boundary, if you think of it as a circle like this, our boundary it's like an invisible barrier that's around us, a fence, if you will, with just metaphorically for right now. But this fence is what protects us psychologically. It's our first line of defense against stress. And it functions a lot like the border of a country, whereas, the border here is, across this border is where we conduct psychological trade with others. It has its own customs and immigration service, if you will. We let certain people near us, we keep certain people away, for instance. And our boundary is important because it's the tank that holds everything else inside it. And when I say that, for instance, our boundary is, it holds our rights, our human rights, like our right to privacy, for instance, our freedom, free will, freedom to have whatever opinion we want. Our, morals and ethics are inside there. our character. Our boundary defines our character more or less, and our self-discipline's in there. Our decision-making power's in there. Our intellect's in there, and all our positive emotional energy in all its forms, whether that's confidence, happiness, gratitude, whatever, it's all in there. And this line that represents our boundary, it clearly marks and delineates everything, or it delineates the difference in what we can control versus what we can't. In other words, everything inside here we have 100% control over, whereas outside here we have zero control over anything out here. This could be the weather, the job, the boss, the girlfriend, the boyfriend, the other people with boundaries of our own. We don't control them and shouldn't seek to. And this boundary around us is fortified by our preferences, the things we say yes to, the things we say no to, behavior we'll tolerate, behavior we won't tolerate, things we like, things we don't like. And from there, I mean, our boundary is, I can't overstate the importance of it, because, on the one hand, it's sophisticated, but on the other hand, it's really simple. And our boundary gives us, access to personal power that allows us to pretty much solve any problem we have. Does that make sense, April?
Yeah, absolutely.
What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. For those of you who can't see right now, he showed a visual of a circle, and it had all of these different things inside of it. And I think that was a big thing for me when I was learning about boundaries years ago, which transformed my life, because it was the lack of boundaries was the root of so many of the other issues, especially relational issues that I was having. Lots of confusion around people that were in my life, and were they for me? Were they not for me? And to what degree did they have to violate me for me to say, that's a no, that's a no. And because I couldn't think for myself, I couldn't make decisions for myself. I felt, especially for me, coming from a background of not wanting to be judged and wanting a perfectionism of sorts, that I'm going to do everything well all the time. So who you're allowing in that circle with you is crucial for your own improvement, your own fulfillment of your life and the things that you're trying to accomplish in your life. So yeah, I love that background on that, because that's one of the first things I read in the book Boundaries, by it's Cloud and Townsend is the book that I read. That the first thing they talked about was the circle. They talked about a gate, and it was a visual of, if this is how I perceived it and remember it, this may not be what the book actually said, but it's what I remember thinking after I read this part about the gate around me, is that if this is my yard and I want to have a party in my yard, then I have allowed people to come through the gate and have a good time. And then when the party's over, they need to leave. But if I'm asleep in my house and people are having a party on my yard, and there's red Solo cups everywhere, and there's trash everywhere, and there's music, I didn't even say they could come in there, but I left the gate open. And that always stuck with me, that I have to do a better job at redefining what are my boundaries and shutting the gate, because I'm trying to get a good night's sleep. And I just remember that always stood with me. And it's something I always think about when I'm talking to people who are struggling with boundaries. If I feel like they're trying to take a nap and people are having a party in their yard, I'm always like, their gate's open. So that's a great example.
Yeah. The thing is, I learned about this from a self-development seminar that I bought online called Mind OS. It was by Dr. Paul Dobransky. And I've learned more from him as far as this subject goes than anyone else. And I mean, it transformed my life too. I mean, you and I had this conversation last week. I mean, we both, I guess, had a similar background in some respects, but the first time you say no to something, it's just so crippling almost, but it's liberating at the same time. And once you get really good at it, it becomes easy. You know what I mean? We had this conversation last week that we both were raised in situations where we were not allowed to have boundaries, not allowed to say no, don't, or stop, not allowed to question anything. That was mine. And, boundaries are ultimately what got me ostracized from my family, and people might think that's bad, but it saved my life, really and truly, if I'm going
Yeah.
to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that conversation that we were having last week in regards to saying no, because the point that I made was the first time you ever say no, it is going against everything you know to be true. And so it literally in the body can feel like I'm about to die. I'm literally about to die if I say no. And all of the reaction in the body that you could probably speak to that happens when you say no to something and you are wired and programmed to go along, to be nice, that was a big thing for me. Some of it comes from childhood and a lot of it comes from being so young in corporate America before I knew who I was, and knowing that there are repercussions on the other side of saying, no, stop, quit, I don't agree. Let's look at this a different way. Challenging somebody that could lead to being fired, there being repercussions. So you learn to just tailor everything you're going to say and do to mimic what's happening around you. But I was sharing with you that even recently I had to say no. I have to say no all the time, but when I have to say no to people who are more in the inner circle of my life, that's still very challenging. And I still sometimes
Oh,
feel that 5-year-old little girl in me, or that scared 19-year-old girl in corporate America that's afraid to use her voice. But even though the feelings are there, I know what's on the other side because I practice it. And I know that you can do this and just go right through with it. And each time it just reinforces that confidence in myself that I'm protecting myself, and that I don't mean that to mean harm to anybody around me, in the sense that the people who are in my sphere now are very mature and positive, uplifting people, that they're not going to take offense to that. Whereas in the past, the people who get really agitated when you set boundaries with more of those toxic people.
yeah, exactly. I mean, when you're able to say no when you have to, I mean, that pretty much represents healthy boundaries. People with healthy boundaries are able to say no and also hear no without feeling rejected. And the thing is, when we have trouble saying no, I'm going to pull up another little diagram here. But when we have trouble saying no, we have a gap in this fence around us. It's a hole in our boundary. And I want to stress here, this is not my intellectual property. This is stuff I learned from Dr. Paul. It's not exactly in his words, but it's paraphrased. I just want to be clear about that. But he talked about holes in our boundary are areas of our life where we have difficulty saying no or hearing no, difficulties where we have problems tolerating rejection or this type thing. And what happens is, when we have this hole in our boundary regarding whatever it might be, it causes us to suffer. We suffer through these holes. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that everything that falls inside our boundary here, we have 100% control over, where we have nothing, or we have 0% control over everything out here. Now, think about this. Now, we've got all our psychological fuel in here, basically, positive emotional energy. Now, think about being in a traffic jam, and you're cut. We've all done it. We cuss, we tailgate, we honk the horn, and we're mad. We grab the steering wheel and clench our fist and this type thing. And what we're doing when we do that is we have a hole here, and our fuel here is draining out the bottom of it really fast. We're burning emotional energy that we could be using elsewhere in a way that doesn't serve us well. Make sense?
Oh, that's great. And as soon as you said that, it made me think about, specifically for Blushing Phoenix community listeners, that is something that for people who struggle with erythrophobia, chronic blushing, there's a sense of rejection constantly. So there's a suffering that happens based on the social visual cue of what blushing represents. And that's something that we talk about a lot. And on my own journey with it, to overcoming the actual phobia of turning red, even though the body may still do it, is that I was giving my power away to so much outside of me, and the thoughts and the rejection and the judgment. how do you think boundaries plays into that? Because as I'm seeing that visual of the fuel running out of the bottom in the traffic jam, I'm like, that's exactly what happens with blushing, with the belief we've given ourselves about what it means if I turn red in front of other people. That all of that energy and all of that confidence and all of those personal boundaries that we have and the power that we have in that circle just is flooding out the bottom.
It's, people with healthy boundaries are very effective problem solvers. And I hope this is about the only way I really know to address that. But people with healthy boundaries can see in any problem, what they can control versus what they can't. So with that being said, the very first step in solving any problem is to let go of what you don't control. And other people's perceptions of us are something that we don't control. That's about really the only way that I know to address that. Now, I've used this example that if I could solve one problem in the whole world, it would be, I would end child abuse. I've been on the wrong end of it. And, if you think about it, it's a worldwide problem. It's an epidemic. If you look at people like Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, they were all sadistically abused as children. And I think most of our problems come from that. With that being said, that's a problem that would fall out here at the end of the day. So every problem, and it doesn't matter what the nature of the problem might be, some portion of it, the solution to solving the problem, one portion of it's in here and some portion of it is out here. Now, the reality is I can't solve that problem by myself. It's just impossible. So I can't spend a lot of energy worrying about that. What I can do is I can make a decision to expand my intellect and get a degree like I did. I could write a book like you did. I can do things like that. Create my podcast was one thing. We can do things like that add to the overall solution, but we can't. And I hope I didn't get too far off topic there.
No, this is fantastic. I want you to. This is fantastic because seeing the representation of this circle is really powerful because I started Blushing Phoenix because I had a problem and I was trying to figure out the problem alone. And I didn't want to invite a lot of people into it that I knew in my circle because the fear was it has to do from, we talk about childhood and child abuse and things of that nature. And even from my own story, it may have not been a physical or conscious thing that somebody was doing to me, but it all stems from there. It stems from, am I getting your approval based off of how I'm behaving? And so that is what I've carried with me. And from a lot of people who I've talked with, just in general and in the Blushing Phoenix community, the only difference with people who are part of Blushing Phoenix is that their skin turns red. Other people have hyperhidrosis. You can't really see it unless you're like close to them and see the sweat on them. Some people, they have heart palpitations or things that are happening inside their body. They're having a fight or flight reaction to the environment around them. It's just with Blushing Phoenix, the only thing that sets us aside from everybody else is that our skin turns red, and it gives a visual cue that there's something going on inside of you that we feel starts to deteriorate who we are on the outside based off of what is being shown. It's telling a different story because for some people, they are actually struggling with a conscious fight or flight reaction to a perceived threat in the environment. But for others like myself who have been on the journey, I may just get excited or get hot or I may feel safe, but my body is catching some sort of cue that this is that dangerous moment. This is that moment right here based off of whatever just happened. And it stems from childhood. And then it stems from being young and going into corporate where that same thing was there, that if I behave well, I'm rewarded. If I do not behave well, I am not rewarded. And then you become 38 like I am now, have a better sense of who you are, have better direction in your life, have really solid and great boundaries that I can always work on, but they're pretty solid. And still, I think that some people look at me or may look at you and go, well, look at all the things you've accomplished. And I'm like, but it's still there. There's still things that happen, but it's just a different response in my body, but it does stem from things that happened in childhood.
You just made a really good point. And it doesn't matter who you are. I'm going to turn my phone off here because I'm scared it's going to ring. But you just made a really good point, because and anybody watching this, please don't think that I'm trying to come off as, as critical, because I'm not. Anything I say here, I've lived myself. But you make a really good point though, April, because no one has a perfect boundary. Everyone has defects. It doesn't matter. And, let me ask you this. This is kind of, I want to segue just a second, because you brought up another point about fight or flight. And have you ever heard the term observing ego?
No.
Well, what observing ego is, this is something else I learned from Dr. Paul. It's the real-time ability to step outside yourself and monitor your own behavior as you behave and adjust course as you need to. Now, imagine this, that I'm in a verbal argument with somebody, but I have really good observing ego skills. I'm in an argument and I step outside myself and I look back. It's like an eyeball watching what we're doing. But I step outside and I look back and I think, you know what? I'm starting to get mad here. I'm still arguing. Step outside myself again, look back. And I ask myself, is this really going anywhere? I'm still arguing. I step outside myself again and I look back and I say, you know what? No, it's not. Why don't I quit? And I do. And the argument ends.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've done, in essence, is take the controls of my life and steer it another direction. And I think in a way this applies to what you just said, because, when you can realize when you're in this state, this fight or flight, then you can do something about it. But back to the argument example, if I had continued to argue, I would have been running on animal behavior, and the fight would have had control of me, and it could have spiraled out of control. Whereas if I've got good observing ego skills and I move it, and I move another direction, then hopefully it ends in a win-win situation. Make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Because I think what happens is once that fight or flight reaction is triggered, everything's on autopilot at that point. And what you're talking about with observing ego, I have never heard the term, but I do that all the time. I actually will be in the middle of talking, usually to my husband. I'll be talking to him about something. And it's like in the moment of still talking, there's an observing me that will go, this is not a fruitful thing to say, or it might be gossipy or whatever it may. And I'll go, you know what? Never mind. This is not going to add any value to you or me if I continue to talk about this. But I don't know when that happened or how I got to that point. Do you know? So for people who are listening and go, whether they're blushers or flushers or they're just regular humans, and they go, yeah, but once I'm in that moment or I'm in that argument or I'm flushing or like, I can't make it stop. I know you can, because I've been in the middle of that before, but what would you say to that?
It's easier said than done. I mean, there are a lot of areas in my own life I can, I could metaphorically say, or somewhat similar, but I mean, it is hard, especially if, it comes from early trauma and stuff. It's just stuff that has to be processed and dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not easy.
Yeah, because I can't tell you when that started happening for me, but that's been a huge part of my journey. Is I remember two things. I remember the first time that my thoughts, like my shower thoughts, weren't either in the past, me having an argument in the past of what I should have said, or in the future of like, maybe there's something going on at work with my boss, and this is what I'm going to say to her if she says this to me. And I'm there. I remember the first time my shower thoughts were more in the moment, and that was new to me. And I remember thinking like, what is this? Because I just thought everybody does that. And once I became more aware, it was when I started setting boundaries is when it started. And then I started becoming more aware. And you and I talked about this as well the other day about when I became aware. And that's when I first started flushing because I became so aware of myself in the environment, my breathing so much that I was holding my breath in the environment, not to take up any space or be seen. It was like I flipped from what I thought was a confident, like who gives a crap person, to all of a sudden this like over aware, hyper fixated on everything, hypersensitive to everything, and
Hyper vigilant.
yeah, hyper vigilant, and then just became super insecure for a few years of this like hole of me. But that hole is also what took me into a deep depression, almost to the point of suicide. But then it was, I'm cautious to say this is my own experience, my own personal journey, but that also is exactly what I needed. I needed to go into that hole to be able to see a lot of things there, get quiet, the things I was running from, the things I was scared of. It literally almost took my life. But coming out of it, I came out a whole different human.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I'm the same way. I mean, I've had the suicidal thoughts too, but I was determined I wasn't going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for what that's worth, it's, I think a lot of times that's, of course, that's another subject, but, I think people who carry that out are incredibly sad to the point that they will do anything to escape it.
Yeah.
It's really, really sad.
Yeah. And I think when you've been that dark of a hole before, what that's like, your judgment becomes a little different on it because you've been close to it. So it's a little different. Everything's so personal on each individual's journey that, like, I know for myself, I can't tell you why I didn't, but I know that there was this anchor of hope that there's more. There's just like a fire burning in my belly. Like, there's just more for me. This is not the end. This is more for me. And I know that so much of that, even to that point, and I think the point I'm trying to make here is that when you set the boundaries, all hell breaks loose.
Oh yeah. Your circle gets small real fast.
You get broken in real fast.
Oh yeah. I mean, people are used to treating you a certain way. It's like in my family, I mean, I was conditioned from when I was a small child that I was supposed to be a doormat. And then I finally got to the point, where I was like, you know what? No, this doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Same. It was more of I'm so easy to get along with. I go along with what everybody wants to do. I don't have an opinion. I don't ruffle the waters. So it's easy to like me and hang out with me. But when I have an opinion, what's wrong with you? What's going on?
yeah, I mean, people freak out because they're not used to it. It throws them out of their comfort zone, and it brings to light their own issues, and they want to run from it rather than face it. I mean, you and I had this conversation last week that we were conditioned to be that way, but now that we've gotten healthy here, that both of us agreed that neither one of us take any BS from anybody.
No.
I don't.
Yeah, as I always say, I'm a nice person until I'm not. And to me, even then, even that language, it's not that I'm not nice or not nice. I have boundaries and I respect myself and I trust myself. And a lot of times that means, like you said, your circle is going to be really small. So for me, before I set boundaries, I had all these friends, I had all these activities, I was invited to all sorts of things. I was very much in the center of life and what was going on. When I started setting boundaries, my circle dwindled so fast.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think a lot of the depression came from, I was alone for the first time in my life. And when you're alone, this is what my first book, Pressing Forward, was about, was, pressing through fear and anxiety to find my truest self. I was flooded with anxiety and depression because I was just me. There was no distraction. And I was very aware of who I am and not really sure who that was anymore, which made my whole world feel like it was falling apart. So boundaries right off didn't feel like it was a great thing. But now that I'm on the other side, it's great.
You bring up a really good point right there, because, when we have holes in our boundary, huge holes, where we were looking at a circle earlier, your boundary would be vague in shape, meaning that it would have huge holes in it. And, when that's the case, our identity can come into question. We're not living in a very solid, identity that we're not living in a solid identity, and we're not presenting one to others. So what I mean by that, have you ever known anyone, and I've been this person myself, who, and you alluded to it just a second ago, but people who never seem to have an opinion. Like, we can go wherever you want to eat. I don't care. Anything's fine with me. I'll wear any clothes. Anything on television is fine with me. And these people, don't have a very well defined identity. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So we saw a circle a minute ago. Okay. So if you say, so what is that? It could be anything. So if someone has big holes in their boundary like this, it represents areas of their life where they don't have preferences, or these big holes that they suffer through. They're not presenting a very well defined identity to others. Now, this is the way Dr. Paul presented it, and I thought it was brilliant. And this is my own twist on it, but I'm the kind of guy that I say no to the news. I just don't watch it. But I say yes to something self-development, something positive, something of that nature. And I'm the kind of guy that, I say no to the Kansas City Chiefs, and that's a hard no. And I say yes to the Raiders. I've been a fan since 1974. And I say no to Chinese food. And I say yes to Italian. And I don't want to offend anybody, but I typically say no to country music in my life and yes to rock. It's just me. So when I say that, doesn't it give you a little bit better idea of who I am here rather than this? See, if I say no to the Chiefs and no to the news and no to this, yes to this, no to this, then it becomes, this is exactly who I am. You know who you are. And if you go back to problem solving, if you have a solid boundary here, a solid set of preferences in every area of your life, every detail, yes to this, no to this, yes to this, no to this, it gives you a solid identity. But when it comes to problems, it helps you better at problem solving because, nothing inside here is vague anymore. So nothing out here would be vague either. So if you were to say, I can't quite put my finger on what's going on, or I'm overwhelmed, or this type thing, it represents a boundary problem within the problem, whatever it might be. Because as I say, with a solid boundary, nothing in here is vague. So any problem that falls out here is not vague either.
Yeah, that is perfection. It's something about the visual aspect. So for those of you who are listening on the podcast, I'm going to link in the description box below, and I'm sure Hank might do this as well, how you can actually get to the video of this, so you can actually see the visuals, because if you're a visual learner, this is transformational for me. It just being a part of the conversation.
I'm telling you, I cannot overstate what this seminar did for me.
Yeah.
It saved my life literally, because at the time, this was me. I'm not saying it was everybody else, but my boundary problems drove every other problem that I had in my life. I was an alcoholic, bad alcoholic. And it wasn't that I wanted to be drunk. It was that I wanted to quell all this internal conflict that I had inside me. And it came from not having a boundary.
Yeah. And that was exactly similar to my story, in the sense that I noticed that not having a boundary, and really the tricky thing about people who are conditioned to not have those boundaries, not have those thoughts for yourself, is you could have asked me 10 years ago, well, what do you think? And I would say, I don't really care. And everything in me really didn't care because I was so programmed to, I don't care. I don't have a thought about this. I really don't care. That when I started setting boundaries, and the reason why I started setting boundaries to begin with is because I realized that a lot of like the friendships that I had, I don't really know what happened, but one day I just walked away from that group and I felt like I didn't feel good. I know what happened. I met my husband, and my husband is like full of light and wisdom and positivity and doing something with his life. It's part of what I was really intrigued. I was so intrigued by him when I met him because I'm like, wow, he's like 23 at the time and he's got his life together in comparison to what I was used to meeting and knowing.
Wow.
And I was so enthralled by and of who he was. And I'm like, how are you like that? Like, who are you from a different planet? And I started hanging out with him. And then I remember one day going to hang out with my group of girlfriends, and I didn't like it. It wasn't fun. The things they were talking about, I didn't appreciate. I didn't want to be a part of it. And when I walked away and just reflected on that over the past or the next day or so, just like, what's wrong with me? Why do I not feel something's off? And it's like you said, I wasn't sure what it was, but something was off because I was aware of a new way of life. And because of Tony, I was aware of there's more to thinking, there's more to conversation. And I like the way that feels in my body, as opposed to hanging out with this group of girls and we're talking about low vibrating stuff, negative energy stuff. And then I leave and I just feel separate from who I was when I met them a week before that, after hanging out with somebody like Tony.
Well, your boundary is what defines your character as well. And that's what was happening there. You were building character.
Yeah, exactly. Building character. And, one thing that's interesting, Hank, that I'll share about recently, I was on the news. It's funny you said you say no to the news. I say no to the news also. And so the anchor that met with me, I didn't even know who he was, but apparently everybody knew who he was. But I say no to the news, so I had no clue. But recently, talking about the flushing and who are you and what created that. And because I think the flushing for me is not my obstacle anymore. It's why is it happening? And so for so long it was happening because of all those things on the outside of the circle, but it's also because when you just showed the broken lines in the circle, that also, and that is how those outside things were impacting my boundaries altogether, just me, my identity altogether. And when I was on the news recently, the biggest thing for me was not necessarily I'm going to turn red while they have the camera on me, because a lot of people from Blushing Phoenix were like, how did it go? Did you turn red? That's a big thing for them to see, is that you showed up on live TV with this thing. And I do it obviously for me, but I'm doing it to show them we can show up. Nobody cares like we do. You can show up. But also, the most interesting thing, Hank, is that I did not flush on live TV because I felt so in my element and so alive and so true to myself that it's like it didn't even happen. And when I walked off set and I walked over to Tony and I looked him dead in his face, big smile, like a child. I was like a child. Like I was giddy and I was jumping around. I said, I was made for this. And he goes, yeah, you were. And then I realized I didn't even think about flushing or anything. I never turned red. So it was so interesting to me that in an environment where all eyes are on you, but we were talking about my book, my art, I had full power and control over my responses because it was mine. And I knew 100% what I was talking about because it's mine. I can give no wrong answer because it's my answer. And there was nobody else attached to it besides obviously the news, but that didn't scare me. That didn't scare me that I was, at a network talking on live TV. Leading up to that, I definitely had butterflies in my stomach. But once you start the process and you're in it, I just felt so connected to myself.
That's observing ego is what that is. And, that's just a really good skill to have. If you don't have observing ego, you tend to wind up with the life nobody else wants, the husband or wife nobody else wants, the job nobody else wants. It's just a really important skill to have. I would, if anyone I'm not asking anybody to believe anything I say here, but if everybody watching this would just take one thing from it, it would be a really cool skill to have, to be able to recognize when you're suffering. And that comes from observing ego. And suffering is when we burn our energy on stuff we can't control.
Oh, that's good. So what would you say from your own experience? And I can share about mine as well, but for you, after you had this knowledge of boundaries, were you immediately like, this is my problem? And then what did you do to start the next, like, what was the first step after that?
The first step after that was, I realized that this is something that I've got to deal with. No matter how hard it is, this is something I've got to fix, because I've got so many problems right now. And I remember I was working in the beer business at the time. I think I told you this last week, but the first time, I was with a customer down in Ripley, Tennessee, a little south, right off the Mississippi River down there. And a customer asked me for my personal cell number. And I'd been conditioned all my life not to ever say no, to go along, just to go along to get along and all that stuff. And I said, respectfully, I don't give my personal cell number out to people that aren't, that aren't my friends. And he's like, okay, that's fine. And I was almost crippled before I did that. And I walked out to my vehicle and I was like, I just felt liberated, almost like a piano had fallen off my back.
Yeah. It's so freeing when I practice it for the first time. And even recently, like now in business, I had somebody reach out to me and say, hey, it's been a long time. I would love to catch up. I'm actually thinking about writing a book and I would love to just pick your brain a little bit about that. And when you have boundaries, as much as I would love to just give myself away all the time, I know I can't, because I know that drains my energy. And, but I also have AP Creative, which is where I can provide services at a charge for you to meet with me. And we could talk about these things. So I know now how to craft those responses, and that's amazing that you're trying to write a book. I think you should, that is my heart for people, is to get their art out into the world and stop being so debilitated by who we think we're not, to just put it out there. It's if I can do it, anybody can do it. But I messaged him back and I just said, and I gave him my website and I just said, feel free to take a look at some of the services. Let me know if any of these are a fit for you, and we can talk about what that potential fee would be. And if that is not something that is in alignment with where you're at right now, sign up for the newsletter, because I'll be sharing some free resources and tips. And that was my boundary, was I absolutely want to help you, but helping you doesn't mean I have to say yes to you. And in fact, sometimes saying no is helping somebody more than anything in certain situations. But in this situation, if I give myself to everything, then what am I saying? If I'm saying yes to everything else, what am I saying no to? And for me, it is my mental health, me first. If my cup is empty, I can give nothing to anybody else. And then my family. And that is my strong, strong yes. That is my strong yes inside of that circle. And then there's some other things. So like you said, when something is coming kind of on the outer sphere that I love and I wish I could just give to, but because it's not in that yes bucket, it's in maybe a maybe-ish, not necessarily a no, but I have to throw it in a no bucket. But it's more of a no, but here's this opportunity. It can become a yes with this.
You just brought up another really good point. Healthy boundary function, when we have these holes in our boundary, these areas in our life where we have difficulty saying no and hearing no, the word no fixes this. It fortifies this. Mm-hmm. But with that being said, where this gap is, rather than just being a hard no and building a wall there, what needs to be there is a door where you could open it up and let somebody in, let somebody close to you, but you can also close it.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah. When actually, this is a great point, because when I first started setting boundaries, I just slammed the door shut.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
I was so mean. Like I had a great mentor. His name is Dr. Jason Brooks. He's a PhD psychologist. And I remember meeting with him. He actually was my boss, but I tell you, he gave me free therapy for like a year and a half because we worked together. But I remember him saying a lot of times when somebody has been conditioned to be one way, once they become aware of the other way, they go way to the other side of the like the pendulum swings all the way to the other side so that they can fully get away from what was. And then they realize, like, I don't really think this is the answer either. And then they start to move their way back to what is true to me. And that door is perfect because I had that thing padlocked shut when I
well,
first started
yeah.
setting boundaries.
And I was the same way. But the reality is walls are just as unhealthy as holes at the end of the day.
Oh, that's good. That's so good. Yeah, because I was not satisfied there. If you build a wall and you just brick yourself in for safety, well, now I'm not safe either.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the thing that's so unfortunate is people just don't know this stuff. If they did, you know, they wouldn't suffer.
And I think it's like we said the other day when we were talking, we're like, even I forgot how foundational this is. When I look back at my journey and I look at like, what was my pivotal turning point? It was boundaries. It was when I learned, and like I said, I read a book, and even back then I was so young. It's hard for me to read a book now. I just, somebody who I admired said, you should read this book. And I did. And it was a tough book to read through the first half of it, but I kept going. And then I remember it was showing me a new way. And it was helping to build character based off of new information. And then you have to go apply it. And I couldn't not apply it, no matter how scared I was and trembling. Like you said, when you told somebody no about your phone number, it was saying no to an event, going out somewhere. And then knowing the fear of, now that I've said no, I have to respect the boundary of the other person, because you become aware of other people's boundaries, whether they know they have them or not, that they may choose to walk away from me. And that's on the outside of the circle. I can't control that.
That's right. And, you know, most of what I did in grad school when I was getting my master's, a lot of it centered around boundaries, but it also centered around cluster B personality. And those are the bad ones. But
can you tell a little more about what that is for people that don't know?
Cluster B personality, that is narcissistic personality. That's antisocial personality, which is psychopathy, or histrionic personality, or borderline personality, which I don't really agree with that term. I think it's unfairly applied a lot of time, to women who are actually, it's really a trauma response rather than some personality or character disorder. But the thing is, if someone is in an abusive situation, it becomes a life and death matter to fix your boundaries. It does. It really does. I knew on an unconscious level that this was something that I had to fix, or it was going to kill me. My body was telling me. And I mean, but it's that critical. Yeah. I mean, if someone is in an abusive situation, they're breaking into your boundary. You're not letting them in, they're breaking in. And what that does, it causes trauma and everything else. Now, I want to bring up another point. Let me see if I've got another one of these with a gap in it. Yeah, I do. So just say, for instance, you've got a hole in your boundary and you've got all your internal resources in here. It's like you have your own internal Fort Knox right here, but you left the windows open. And you think of the term, this is something else Dr. Paul brought up that just really was eye-opening for me. But when you have a hole in your boundary like this, you're giving other people quick and easy access to your good stuff you got in here. You've heard of, this person is pushing my buttons. What is the button itself? The button itself is this hole where they can just reach in here and take your stuff away from you. Have you ever had anyone who reached inside your boundary and tried to take your decision-making power away from you and boss you around? or tell you how you need to feel or who you should hate or that type stuff. That's a feature of narcissism that I saw in my own family. My mother was, one of these people that, if she hated somebody, by God, you better hate them too. And, it doesn't, she sees people as extensions of her rather than where I end and you begin. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's such a great breakdown too, because I think for a lot of people who grew up in that and maybe have not come to a place where they're even recognizing something's actually wrong with that is unhealthy.
Yeah. I mean, when you grow up in it, you think it's normal, and I'll be honest with you, some of this stuff passed down to my kids, except the difference was I recognized it. I stopped it. I apologized to them and I let them address it with me. I sat there like a man and I let them say whatever they wanted to say because I did not want them to suffer the way I'd had to. But, everything that I did was unconscious. I thought it was normal. It's what I dealt with myself.
Yeah. When you shared that with me last week and you shared that it was unconscious, it really gave me a lot of awareness for what I shared with you about my mom and realizing that so much of that was unconscious based off of her background and upbringing. And that's why even to this day, we can have a relationship, but I had to set a firm boundary because for me as the child, not knowing where does this end and where do I begin? Because something feels off now. And a lot of that had to come from that character development. It had to come from seeing a new way of life. And it came from having somebody in my life that had really strong boundaries, a very firm sense of who he was, that then I started to see that's a possibility. It's why I like to connect with people like you and others who are doing something, who are creating, who are putting something out there into the world, because the iron sharpens iron. And I realized like I was telling my husband, even just in collaborating with you for a podcast, I'm like, I already learned, like, even having a Zoom background, I've never done this before with all my Zoom videos. This makes me better by being around you. Somebody who is secure in who they are, their identity, you've got your boundaries, you're headed in that same direction on the same path, similar paths of where I'm going. And it's like you find your people along the way. And going back to the loneliness that comes a lot of times after you set boundaries, if you don't have those supporting relationships in your life and you're doing it on your own, which is, luckily I did have my husband there. But it still was a very lonely and isolating experience. But I read this thing that said, your people will find you. And that on the others, there's a huge for me, it was a lonely walk, but I, in the moment it's awful. But now that I'm on the other side of it, I'm like, the character would have never been built if I didn't take the long walk by myself. But I am so surrounded. I think, because I say this because I think sometimes when you set those boundaries and you're alone for the first time and you feel like maybe you're never going to connect with anybody ever again because you're in the in-between, is that you meet people who are healthy, who are supportive, and you become even more of this better version of yourself, this highest empowered self, because you've got it inside of you, but then you seem to just somewhere out of nowhere start connecting with people that are on very similar paths that continue to reinforce that new way of life for you. And then it just becomes like a norm. Like I said, we're having this conversation and I was like, oh yeah, boundaries is what started it all for me. And I don't even think about boundaries hardly anymore.
Well, I'd heard you say that, and that was why I reached out to you. But, I'm trying to remember where I was going with this. But if you are in a really unhealthy family, what happens is boundaries are enmeshed. There's no, more people, everybody functions as one rather than independently. And when you separate that and become independent yourself, then you do spend a period of time alone, or your circle becomes really small. But like you said, your circle's healthy.
Yeah. And I would always say when I was on that journey in that really lonely place, I just remember reminding myself there's a difference between loneliness and alone. There's a difference in how I'm going to spend this time not in a victimized way. This is the start of my life from here. And if people want to be with me, they will choose me. If they don't, then we're going to go our separate ways. And that is easier said than done, but that is probably was my deepest fear, was that people won't choose me. What if they don't choose me? And I've talked to people before in some of my coaching sessions where that is their biggest fear. Well, but what if they don't choose me? And as your visual represents, that's on the outside. It's on the outside of the circle.
I think that at the end of the day, April, I think our wounds are where we can really, mine for psychological gold. I think our wounds are where we find our purpose at the end of the day. And I think that's where we're both kind of, trying to make our mark on the world where we can make it just a little bit better. I think we all want to do that. But I think people who have wounds like that have a lot to offer, really.
Yeah, I agree. I noticed that it really seems to be the place where a lot of my gifting has come from, is through the wounds. And it really is a reframing of sorts, not denying the things that have happened, but even when I was in the deepest, darkest depression of my life, I wrote a book because I wanted to say that nothing is wasted, and this could be something good. And I remember when I was in that deep, dark depression, I would have conversations with people and I just felt like they weren't hearing me. So I would go to the bookstore and I would just grab a book on how somebody overcame depression. And I would sit on the floor of Barnes and Noble as a grown woman on the floor and just read the book and be reminded that I am going to overcome this. I am on my way out right now. I'm on the other side. I just got to get myself there. And so because those books helped me is why I decided to put my experience in a book while I was heavily in the middle of it still. But I wrote as if I was healed already. And I came out of it. And it was through a major wound.
Well, see, I mean, I'm the same way, because anytime I've ever found myself depressed, the first thing I did was I jumped into a book or a seminar like Mind OS. When I found it, I was probably at close to the lowest point in my life. And just this information about boundaries got me in the right direction. And it's been up from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and you and I talked last week also about my season with postpartum depression that kind of took me by surprise. That was a whole new experience. And I sulked in it for months. The feeling of, I just can't, like, I know there's this other side of me, and which was actually making the hole a lot deeper, because I know how strong I can be. And I know, and when you're in those mental places, you're arguing with yourself, get up and go. And then I don't really know what switched on, but I'm like, following my routine is not going to do it. I've got to get uncomfortable to get my life back, which was, I just started setting a routine for myself that I know is positive, that I know will get me out of it. And that it doesn't matter whether I want to or I don't want to, this is what we're doing. And I started doing those healthy routines again. And within about 6 months, I was out of it, and I mean, within the first week, I already felt like myself again, but it just felt like that grasp was still there a little bit, but it was in knowing that there's a time. I'm a feeler, but there's a time even for me where I have to say, forget about your feelings. Here's what we're doing. And that wakes me up, because there's a time to be in feelings with me. And there's a time to say, you're more than that. You're better than that. What are you going to do about it? And I gave myself that pep talk.
Yeah.
Like, forget about your feelings. This is what you're doing. Here's the plan. Execute. Go.
But you bring up another point. I learned so much from Dr. Paul Dobransky. I mean, I'm telling you, and you just said something else that resonated with me. You brought up what you did, in essence, was make a decision to do something. And decisions are what give life to our lives. Decisions are what delineate the difference between living and non-living things. I mean, if, biologists tell us that life is irritable. What that means is our environment does things to us, we do things back. And that implies a decision has been made. Trees, on one hand, they are alive because they make this crude decision for their branches to grow up toward the sun rather than toward the shade. A rock, on the other hand, is not living, and it can't make a decision to roll uphill. So decisions are what give life to our lives. And when we don't make decisions, we tend to spiral. It's sort of a psychological atrophy, kind of. We regress in our growth. And the only way to jump out of that rut we find ourselves in is by making a decision to do so.
And I would think too that goes back to that yes and no concept as well, because
exactly, yeah.
This is so good. Oh man, I hope everybody is, if nobody else gets anything from this, I am getting it right now, because when I think about the psychological trauma in corporate America, that has been, it was from my childhood, but really what reinforced that into me was if I made a decision and I was reprimanded for that decision, it taught me that my decision-making skills are not right. And so therefore, listen and look for what everybody else says first and just follow suit, or don't care. Let everybody else make the decision. But when I am in my own element and there's no boss there's no authority. For example, going to the news the other day, we're sitting in the parking lot waiting for my time to get ready to go up to the door. And I've got the feelings in my body of the discomfort of going on live TV. And it was not an option to not go. And I looked at my husband and I said, even though I feel all the feelings, I think, well, what's the alternative? Turn around and go home? Well, I'm not going to do that. The decision's already been made. I'm going in there. We're doing the thing. Yep. And so it was so black and white for me that yes, there are feelings. I'm uncomfortable. That's besides the point of what I'm feeling. Like, it is like the decision has been made and that's where we're going. And when I think about in corporate America, especially specifically the job I have now, is so psychologically safe that it's taken a year of undoing some things. And I'm still not there, where I'm in a meeting and literally my mind is blank when they're making decisions. I'm part of the leadership team. I have to make decisions as well. And I do now. But I noticed the first time, it's similar to saying no, was the first time I was in a meeting and I felt like I had a thought, like I knew something and I needed to speak it. And everything in my body was in fight or flight mode. Like, don't you dare say it, because it's going against what they're saying. But I could see it so clearly. And I unmuted and I threw my voice out there and I trembled afterwards. And there were no repercussions. I don't really know if there was even validation to it. It just was like, they wanted our thoughts. Like, what do you think? And there were no repercussions. And I remember after hanging up off that call, I just, like, my whole body just needed me to purge. Like, I just cried and cried and cried, because it was the first time I took my voice back and I made a decision or I gave an opinion inside of a meeting. And that has been taught to me over the past, I've been at this company for a little over a year, and them reinforcing over and over again that you can talk here, you can say what you need to say, and you're not going to be penalized for that. And then I realized how wounded I have been to not be able to make a decision, say a thought. And now I'm in an environment. And I say this to say, I met with this doctor. Her name is Dr. Madeline DeHawk. She was I think I might've told you about her. She was on the channel as well. She did a TEDx talk on how she overcame her blushing by using her voice. And so I think it goes to the point of decision. Yes, no. And her biggest factor also was environment. Environment is huge for being able to get into that space of using your voice to making decisions. So I know we can't always control our environment. So that was the thing for me. I could, but in my belief system in that moment, I couldn't just quit my job because there were some psychological things going on there. I had to figure out how to deal with the inside the circle stuff and manage the outside the circle stuff. But I've learned over the past year with boundaries, with our voices, that environment is huge in that.
Now, when you say use your voice, do you mean by, what are you talking about? Tone of voice?
Just speaking up, just saying there's a thought or there's an idea or here's what I think. I'm not going to say it. Everybody's talking. I don't want to talk over anybody else, or there's going to be repercussions if I say that. Who cares? And being conditioned in corporate to just stay quiet.
Yeah. You know, any decision that we make causes psychological growth, any of them. Now, another thing that I learned from Mind OS is that any decision that we make is either constructive or destructive, or it's not a decision. And have you ever thought of this before? The sum total of your life and the quality of your life amounts to the sum total of all the decisions that you've made up to this point. Now, for me, that's kind of a bitter pill to swallow sometimes, because I've made plenty of bad decisions in my life, you know, but at the same time, you know, it's reality. Now, I want to join that with another idea: how we spend time. We spend time in one of three places. And I mean, I've been listening to you, and that the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's relevant, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But we spend time in one of three places: in the past, in the present, or in the future. And have you ever driven to work or driven somewhere and arrive and not really realize how you got there?
Oh yeah. Yes.
Well, where was your mind during the drive? It was either in the past or the present. And, you know, you weren't making a decision about every turn you made or how fast you were driving or anything like that. You were
so you said the mind was in the past, or is it past or the future?
You were either thinking about the past or you were daydreaming about the future.
One of the two.
You weren't making a conscious decision about how fast you were driving or every turn you made or that type thing. Now, when you're in the present moment, which is the best place to be, because it's hard to be anxious or depressed when you're in the present moment. There are things that you can only do in the present moment. You can only make decisions in the present moment. You can only take action in the present moment. You can only access your five senses in the present moment. You can only be intimate with someone in the present moment. We've all got friends that we only see when they broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, you know, and, you know, you're trying to talk to them and be engaged, but they're off every other direction. So you can't really have any kind of intimate conversation with them. So the present moment, where I'm leading up to here, is the present moment is the time frame where we're the most alive and full of life. So observing ego, you have to be in the present moment. And you were talking about, you were at the news station. You were in the present moment. You demonstrated it.
Yeah. And there was no fear in it at all. It was literally listening to him ask the next question so that I could respond to the next question. And wow, that is really interesting, Hank, because wow, because I'm wondering if it wasn't even really anything to do with the publicity or the news station or the gentleman who was talking to me. It was that I was fully there.
You were fully engaged. And you have to be in the present moment, you know, and I'm telling you, Dr. Paul is brilliant. The most brilliant guy I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to link his information so everybody can
know
more about him.
I bought that seminar from a website called menspsychology.com, and the site's not up anymore. I don't know where you would find it. I mean, he was a relatively young guy, not much older than me.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was just brilliant. I can't overstate the value of it. I mean, it transformed my life literally. And I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's all good. I was engaged for like 2 or 3 days listening to it. It was really good.
Yeah. And like you said, it's like a lot of people just don't know.
You don't know what you don't know.
I think people, I mean, even I
And
do know, and I'm listening to us talk, and I'm like, my mind is just exploding with things that will resonate with me and sit with me and marinate for a little bit after we're done here. And as you were stating before, I think even when we were trying to figure out what we were actually going to talk about, we were like, let's talk about boundaries, but then it's like boundaries has so many branches, and I think we've hit on so many of them today. And I think it goes to show that it is sitting there as the foundation, though. And then so much comes out of it.
It all starts with boundaries, every bit of it. Because if you don't have a healthy boundary, you're going to be full of anxiety. You're not going to be able to be engaged because you're worried constantly about some threat that might be coming unconsciously.
Yeah. Wow. That is incredible. And I think even as we were talking about the erythrophobia, that whole situation is that somebody had an occurrence happen where usually it stems from, it was a public thing where a teacher, a student, a lot of times it happens to people in their adolescence where they go, look how red you just got. And it's like funny. And the whole class laughs now because your face is red. And then you get redder because it just got pointed out. And now you're in this psychological loop that I'm going to turn red. And so you actually are creating it by fearing it constantly, which is what creates the erythrophobia. And that was what it has been for me on the journey, was to get through the phobia first, which I was able to move through. And then I believe that as I continue to go down this journey, that the skin flushing will stop. But what I had to do was stop giving so much focus to putting it really had to do with my identity, honestly. Like if I flush, then that's less than. If I don't, then that's positive. It's more of like, I don't even want to worry about that. I want to continue down this journey. If it got put there, it can be rewired. If it wasn't always there. And so it's not so much about, because what will happen a lot of times in this community is we will think we found a solution and then it'll come back and then you're defeated again. So I was like, I can't focus on that anymore. I've got to just focus on like, what am I doing? Where am I going? What are my yeses? What are my nos? And just walk that path, loving myself as I'm doing that. And honestly too, I think you and I might have talked about this too before, is that what I started to realize is that when I'm flushing, sometimes it's just like an environmental thing. Like it feels almost like an allergy to the heat or the cold or something that's happening, usually heat. But if I am actually in a conversation with somebody or something's happening and I start to flush, my body's telling me something in that moment. It is telling me, you don't trust this person that you're talking to. I don't know why, but I don't. And it's never been wrong. It is a very strong, intuitive thing almost. And I always got confused about the fine lines between, is that just me being in survival mode, or is that my body actually telling me, this is a dangerous situation.
You bring up a really interesting point right there. And I don't know anything about erythrophobia at all. I'd never even heard the term until you told me what it was. And I don't know if this would even be, a form of something that would help it. But when I was, I've always been a really big believer in hypnosis, because the subconscious mind is a powerful thing. It drives everything we do. And the way I'm hearing this described, it seems as though that this phobia is some sort of unconscious something being triggered.
Absolutely. Yeah,
so,
it absolutely is.
Now, when I was and I've not started doing it yet, but I've got a certification in clinical hypnotherapy. This would be way above my pay grade, but I did a paper when I was in grad school, and it was on hypnosis. And I found this article in a neuroscience journal, called Brain. This was a peer-reviewed journal that I got from my college library of a study they did in Denmark of people who had traumatic brain injury and who had lost their executive function, lost memory. And what they did, they had 3 groups, but the one they used targeted suggestions on, they were able to tell another part of their brain to handle it, and their memory came back. So it just, it would seem to me that might be an area to look at.
Yeah. And I actually have heard in the community and from people who are struggling with this, and I didn't even know this was a thing, which is so crazy that I wound up creating Blushing Phoenix, because I realized that there are people all over the world who are silently suffering from a chronic fear of blushing. Sure. And that, I guess back in 2007, there was a study done that showed, it said 7%, but I know talking to Dr. Madeline DeHawk, she was saying it's somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population suffers from this. So it's a very shameful, you and I talked about it, like there's a lot of shame in there, but I also believe mine stemmed from a shame place, and a lot of other things. It's so distorted. But I think overcoming erythrophobia, being in this space of not being so worried about it anymore, honestly, not even, there's no or ifs about it. Just, I'm going to live my life regardless, even if it is not aesthetically pretty. And, what was up with there? Oh, what I was going to say is that, I'm going to live my life anyway. So I already know that we can overcome. I already know we can move through that fear. And it wouldn't be any different than any other thing that we can overcome. But I have heard that hypnosis actually can be very helpful, but I've never heard anybody give a true, I was cured or I'm over it. I've had people reach out to me from Blushing Phoenix and say that they tried, but it felt very scammy. And I think you and I talked about it gets a bad rap.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, if someone was going to look at hypnosis as a potential treatment modality, you would need to go to someone like a very, very good clinical psych or a psychiatrist who does it, who understands it, rather than some snake oil salesman.
Yeah, on the internet.
Or stage hypnotist,
Yeah, I think that's what happens, is that a lot of people, there are people who know that this is a niche to talk to people with blushing issues and say, I can cure you. And that's one thing I always say with Blushing Phoenix, I will never claim to cure you. This is my own personal experience. And if you want to come along for the ride, let's go. And that's the thing I love about Madeline DeHawk. Also, she's about to run a pilot group with some people to do, because she does transformational coaching for like executives. And but she was a chronic blusher herself, and she's like in her late 50s now, or I think maybe early 50s now. And she said, it's something that really took a lot of years of her life. And but that's the main thing she said right in the beginning, is I'm going along on the journey of this pilot with her, as a representative of Blushing Phoenix. And she just said, I will never claim to cure you. And I think you give good advice in that, and saying like, who needs to offer that?
Yeah,
because I do believe it can help.
I mean, and the problem with hypnosis is, the reason it's got a bad name is because of this street hypnosis and all this crap. People look at it and they think it's some form of mind control, but it's not really. It's just a form of really, really deep relaxation and visualization, where they can move your conscious mind over here, where they can speak directly into your subconscious mind. And it makes changes just that fast. It's how Tony Robbins does it.
Yeah. And I've heard, that's what I'm like, I heard such fantastic things about it. 2 other things I want to ask you about, because I know we have to begin to wrap it up shortly, but you are certified is it in tapping?
Yeah. I haven't done it yet.
You haven't actually gone through the process of...
No, I haven't actually done it with anybody. I've got the certification. I went through the class and stuff. This has all been something that has been a big goal of mine. What I want to do ultimately is get another master's degree where I can actually, do psychotherapy, because it's where my heart is. And I would like to incorporate that with hypnosis, tapping, cognitive behavioral therapy, that type thing.
Well, and I think these are huge therapies that could be very beneficial to people, especially And of course, I keep referencing some of the erythrophobia stuff because that's a lot of who the audience is. But anybody listening from April Pointer as well, this is remove the word blushing and add your thing in. Is I shared with you, Hank, that my friend Liz, who does Thai yoga massage, had talked to me about that. It sounded like it was very much in the subconscious, and she talked to me about potentially tapping might be effective for anybody who's struggling with chronic blushing, especially if it's a key. Remember I said she told me, you know, you may never find the root because it could be a facial expression, a tone of voice, the way somebody shifts in their chair, and you're triggered and you're looking for what it is. And it could be an accumulation of things. It could be one thing. And you may never find it by just trying to figure it out on the surface. So she wasn't very versed in tapping either, but she had read something in regards to veterans who were suffering with PTSD, and they went through the tapping therapies, and crazy numbers of how many of them were healed from that.
See, I'm wondering if this is some sort of trauma response, you know, due to early attachments. I mean, that's kind of where when we talked about it, that was kind of what I thought, because, you know, when an infant doesn't have a healthy attachment with their primary caregiver, then what happens is if the primary caregiver, you know, gives the baby a nasty look of some sort, then it's internalized as toxic shame. And that stays. I mean, and it debilitates us in so many ways. And that's what I was dealing with.
And I do know that when she told me that about facial cues, I realized that when I would be at work, and
that's what could be triggering it.
Well, I realized when I would be at work and I would be having a conversation, and I'll just mention his name, with Robin. So we both know Robin. Robin is somebody I speak very highly of from
I do too.
One of my past jobs. I love him, and we get along so great. But sometimes I would be in a meeting with him, and if I would notice it, that I would flush if Robin's face looked like it didn't agree with what I was saying. That's when I first started realizing, after my friend Liz said it could be a facial cue.
Go back to that.
Yeah. And because of that, because he was very much, for me as an authority figure, a nurturing authority figure. But then if I felt like he was disapproving, he wouldn't say he's disapproving, but if I felt like he was, based off of his facial expression, which he could have, if he was disapproving, he would have told me he was disapproving, but he may have been somewhere else or thinking about something else, or literally not even meaning anything by it. But I would perceive it. I remember this moment of realizing it and going, he doesn't like what I'm saying. So I would kind of detour what I was saying to try to get the approval of him.
Have you ever, when you're in that response, have you ever stopped? And again, I'm not a psychotherapist. This is just food for thought. Have you ever stopped and thought, you know what, this is a response because of things that happened to me earlier in my life? It's not going on now. I'm fine.
No, like giving it, kind of realizing it's there.
You're validating it, but you're also saying, you know what? No, you don't have control of me anymore.
You're not allowed here. Yeah. You're not supposed to be here.
That's
that
right.
is, I'm going to try that the next time I'm in that situation, because that is very much, like you said, I think it's a trauma response for a lot of people.
I do too, based on it's what it sounds like to me. I can't say for sure, but it's what it sounds like.
Yeah. And when we talked about early attachment, because we talked about previously, we were talking about like nurturing mothers or non-nurturing mothers. And that was one thing that after you and I talked last week, I really thought about some of the things we talked about. And I remember, I don't even know if I shared this with you, but my mom worked third shift for a long time, and she would come home and she couldn't pay us attention. She would go to bed. And so my grandmother would keep us, and we just want mom, we want mom to be with us. So even though it wasn't necessarily like an unhealthy mom situation, but it was still, as a child, my mom's not available to me. And then you couple that up with some of the other things of stresses. And I notice it with my kids now, like when my kids like, mommy, look, and I am like drained, and I'm like, give me a second. Or I have yes and no's with my kids. And my kid, it's 9 o'clock at night and he's dragging on about looking at something on TV. And I'm like, I'm moving on to the next thing and it's bedtime for you. I will say, no, I'm not looking. And he'll say, I just want to show you real quick. I'm like, no, go to bed. And I will walk out and I will feel zero guilt about that. But I think about when I was that age as a kid, oh, I would have internalized that. And I would have internalized that as, I'm not seen, I'm not heard. I just wanted to show her she's so mean. And that would have started to create a lot of that. This is what my mom thinks about me.
And you feel invisible.
Yeah.
Something that's, I guess, a little bit metaphorical, or a way I could apply what you're telling me to give an example in my own life. Now, with authority figures when I was younger, if I felt like they were disapproving, I would just freeze. I mean, and not be able to talk. I would stutter and stammer and all that stuff. And again, I think it goes back to early attachments again with me, whereas, I had internalized all this toxic shame and I didn't have a solid boundary as a result of it. But it all goes back to boundaries. Every bit of it does.
Yeah. It comes back to knowing your yeses and nos. It comes back to knowing your identity. Yeah. It's see what I'm saying? It's like there's so many branches that come out of it. And and I think that's why when I set my boundaries for the first time, when I realized what they were and I started the journey of setting boundaries, it transformed my life.
Exactly. I'll tell you, I came up with the name Viking Mindset for my podcast because, I didn't know who in the hell I was when I was younger. I had no clue. My father split when I was 4 years old. I maybe saw him once or twice a year. My mother was who she is. And, it caused a lot of problems. I didn't really know who I was. And it goes back to identity and not having a boundary. So I have to thank my son for this. The show Vikings came on, back on the History Channel years ago. And I knew that my grandfather on my dad's side, who was probably the best male influence I had in my life, as flawed as he was, but he always talked about, our family came from Vikings in England. And, it became interesting. And I'm like, I'd asked myself, who in the hell am I? And I had all this self-hatred and stuff. And, I thought, this is my ancestry. This is pretty cool. I like this. So I started building it, and the way it came about is how they would set goals, how they would face the scary stuff and overcome it, and would handle fear and that type thing. So that was the root of it.
Yeah.
But that's where it all came from.
Yeah. So that starting of the journey of getting back to yourself. Yeah. It's interesting because in my new book, Lean In, that's something that I wrote in there, even though it's about my dad's cancer journey, but it's about life. It's seriously about life and death. And it's about waking up to your life while you're living is more so what the book is about. But there's a part in there where I was on a writing retreat and I wrote about, sometimes I feel like I'm looking for something out there and to evolve into something out there. But really, what I really think my heart is doing is just calling me back, back. And that was this whole moment for me of it's a returning of sorts, to the innocence, to the child, to that place where there was no question or fear or doubt or any sort of identity crisis. And instead of evolving into this highest version of myself, it's really just returning to the nature of who I am, with the character, which is a refining that will continue to happen all the days of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it started with boundaries. And so I think for anybody who's listening and they're like, okay, great conversation. I'm excited about this. I definitely want to make sure that we share your information so they know how to listen to your podcast. I think you have some really fantastic stuff there. But also what would you say to them? Like somebody's struggling with their boundaries. They've come to realize during this conversation, wow, this is what I need to focus on.
Well, I hope, I hope that if people didn't realize what boundaries were, I hope they had an aha moment. I mean, because this is my opinion. I'm not a PhD. It's my opinion, though, that, a good baseline of mental health starts with healthy boundaries. It starts and ends with it. That's the foundation of everything. And I think once we fix that, once we fix our boundaries and we know what, we say no when we need to say no, and we're not affected by hearing no, a lot of the other stuff fixes itself. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I would agree. And I think just to add one last point to that, something I don't think we talked about too much was it's one thing to say no. It's another thing to hear no. And and they're two sides of the same coin. And being able to hear no, and because even for me, from a rejection standpoint, sometimes hearing no still feels a little oof, but I'm able to know that's not a personal thing because I know how to say no. So when you know it, you recognize it from somebody else, but that it's two sides of the same coin. It is being able to say no, and it's being able to hear.
Got to be able to hear it too, especially like in sales. And I want to add one more thing to it as well. The way to realize that we're suffering, if we have, through a hole in our boundary, is when we find ourselves using vague language like should, as in this client should buy from me. That's out of my control.
Wow. Yeah, that's good. Vague language.
Vague language, should, is the tip off.
Yeah, that's showing that you're in that gray area at that point. Yeah. You're not in the yes or no space.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, it causes suffering. We're burning energy on things we can't control. If I'm worried about a deal closing, then I'm not focused on talking to the next person. Yeah.
Which goes back to being present and being fully engaged.
See, everything fits together. And it's, having a really, really deep conversation on it is, on each one of these aspects of it, is kind of beyond the scope of us being able to talk for an hour. But I hopefully everybody that's listened has gotten something out of it. I hope so.
Yeah, I know for sure I have. I think this is going to be incredibly impactful. And Hank, where can they find you if they want to listen to the Viking Mindset?
Viking Mindset Transformational Therapy podcast. I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Audible, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and a whole list of other ones. I really don't know about it. They just Libsyn automatically puts it in there.
Yeah, I usually list out a couple of mine and then I go, just look on your favorite podcast place and look up this name. So again, I'll link your information below. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I just hope anybody watching this has gotten something from it. That was my hope to begin with. That was why I reached out to you, April. I think you and I both would like to make the world just a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, as we've said before, we talked last week to try to prepare for today. And we wound up like an hour and 40 minutes or so. It was
something like that.
It was a long time. And I said, dang it, if only we could have just recorded this conversation, which is what kind of landed us here. Was you like, you know what? This is a little different than what we usually do. Let's just have a conversation and see how it goes. But
I think this was a better format though, really, because we're able to do the visual stuff as well, rather than just hearing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that I know people like the podcast versions of things so they can just listen on the go. But I think it'll still be beneficial to have people hearing it and knowing that if they go into the links or aprilpointer.com or wherever you may have things listed, they can get to this YouTube channel and actually watch the video and actually see those. The visuals were huge. Those were a huge part of our conversation.
Makes it easier
today
to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hank, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for being here with me on my show as well. Dual purposes. It's been a lot of fun, and I am so grateful to just have the connection to you and to continue to grow alongside you.
Absolutely.
Rise up, rise up, rise up. When you've had enough, when the crowd gets rough, gotta stand up straight. Gonna a champion. When your cloud goes dark.